How did I let this happen? That's the question I ask myself every time I close my eyes at night, and yet every time I open them I find myself wishing for those moments again. You see, this isn't your typical love story. It's one I never thought I'd find myself in. I am Ella, a proud woman in my 40s. I built my tech empire from scratch, every line of code, every late night, every tear I cried alone in my tiny one-room apartment. That's my story, or at least it used to be. Now the story has changed. It all began when I married Wilson. He's a big name in venture capital, handsome, powerful, charming in that way only men with money know how to be. I thought I had everything I wanted: love, stability, and someone who understood my work. But what I didn't expect was Ken. Ken is Wilson's son, a 27-year-old firebrand with big dreams and a startup that honestly had potential. Wilson wasn't convinced. Adora, he'd say, this boy isn't ready for the big leagues, let him try, and when he fails we'll talk. But I saw something different in Ken: passion, drive, a hunger that reminded me of myself when I was younger, fighting to prove to the world that I could be somebody. So I started helping him. At first, it was just advice, late-night brainstorming sessions over cold bottles of MT in the kitchen. Then it became more: investor pitches, strategy meetings, deep dives into his business model. But somewhere between the spreadsheets and the stories of our struggles, things started to change. I can't pinpoint the moment it happened. Maybe it was the night the power went out during one of our meetings, and we sat there in the candlelight laughing at our own awkwardness. Or maybe it was the way he looked at me when I explained why I believed in him more than anyone else. Whatever it was, one night after another long session, I found myself staring into his eyes a second too long, and he didn't look away. From there, things became complicated. When I was with him, I felt alive. Like the Adora I used to be before life became about measures and acquisitions. But every time I went back to Wilson, guilt wrapped around my heart like a chain. Ken and I promised ourselves it wouldn't go too far. We said it was just emotions, just feelings, and feelings could be controlled. But, Ken, the tech world is small, especially in Nigeria, and in this game, one wrong move, one misplaced whisper, can destroy everything. I knew the risks, I knew the stakes. But the heart doesn't care about logic, does it? I wish I could tell you how this story ends, but even I don't know yet. What I do know is that I'm playing with fire, and fire doesn't care who it burns. The morning after that long stare, I woke up with my mind in chaos. Wilson was seated at the dining table, scrolling through his iPad. "Morning, Adora," he said without looking up. His voice was calm, steady, nothing unusual. But inside me, I was a complete mess. I couldn't shake the image of Ken's face from my mind, the way he looked at me like I was more than just his stepmother or some tech powerhouse, like I was something special. I told myself it was a phase. "Adora, get a grip," I whispered to myself in the shower. "You're too smart for this." But later that evening, Ken texted me, "Can we talk?" 3 words, simple, harmless even, but my heart skipped, and I hesitated. I texted back, "Meet me in the study at 8. When he walked in, I was pretending to be busy with a report. The silence between us was loud, louder than the ticking clock on the wall. He sat down across from me. "Adora," he started, then paused. "I mean, more Ken, please, just talk," I cut him off, my voice firm but my heart racing. He looked down, then back up. "I don't know what's happening between us, but I can't pretend it's not there." There it was, the thing I'd been trying to deny, spoken out loud. "Ken, this isn't right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he replied, "but doesn't it feel real to you?" I stared at him, not knowing how to respond. Of course, it felt real, too real. "Ken," I began, trying to sound strong. "This can't happen. Do you know what's at stake? My marriage, your father, our businesses. If anyone finds out." "I know," he said, cutting me off. "I know. But Adora, you're the only person who really sees me. Everyone else just looks at me like I'm Wilson's son, like I can't do anything without his money or influence. But you believe in me." His words hit me harder than I expected because he was right. I did see him differently. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and placed my hand on his. "Ken, I do believe in you, but this is dangerous." He nodded, but he didn't pull his hand away. Instead, he squeezed mine gently, his eyes searching mine. "Sometimes the most dangerous things are the ones we're fighting for." I pulled my hand back quickly, as if his touch had burned me. "Ken, we need to stop this before it goes too far." But even as I said the words, I didn't know if I meant them. He left the study that night without saying another word, and I sat there staring at the door long after he was gone. The next day, Wilson told me we had a dinner party to attend. "I want you to meet a new investor," he said. I nodded absent-mindedly, still replaying my conversation with Ken in my head. At the dinner, I felt Ken's eyes on me from across the room. He was there too, of course. Wilson had insisted he attend to learn the ropes. And then it happened. In the middle of Wilson's toast, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Ken, "Meet me outside." My heart raced as I looked up, locking eyes with him for just a moment before he slipped out the back door. I should have ignored it. I should have stayed at the table, sipping my wine and smiling politely at Wilson's guests. But instead, I stood up, murmured something about needing fresh air, and followed him outside. The air was cool and quiet. Ken was waiting by the garden. His hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Edora," he said softly, "tell me this doesn't mean anything to you and I'll stop." I froze, my words were cut somewhere between my head and my heart. And then, without thinking, I stepped closer. Ken stood there looking at me with a mix of hope and desperation. The garden was quiet except for the distant hum of Lagos traffic. My heart was pounding so loud it felt like it might drown out everything else. "Ken," I began, my voice trembling. Whatever this is, it can't happen." "But why?" he asked, stepping closer. "You can't tell me you don't feel it too." "Edora, you've changed my life in ways I didn't think possible. I don't want to lose that." His words wrapped around me like a soft blanket, but they were suffocating too. I wanted to give in, to tell him I felt the same, but the weight of everything, Wilson, my reputation, my company, pressed down on me. I took a step back. "Ken, listen to me. What we feel might be real, but that doesn't mean it's right. Some lines are not meant to be crossed." He looked hurt, but he nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, "but that doesn't make it any easier." "It won't be easy," I replied, my voice firm, "but it's necessary. You have your whole life ahead of you, Ken. Don't let this ruin everything you've worked for." We stood there in silence, the cool night air heavy with unspoken words. Finally, I turned and walked back into the house, leaving him standing in the shadows. That night, I lay in bed next to Wilson, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't sleep, my mind was a storm of emotions, guilt, regret, longing. But beneath it all, there was a small sense of relief. I had made the right choice, even if it was the hardest one. The next morning, I called Ken into my office. "We need to keep our distance," I said, my tone firm. "Strictly professional from now on, do you understand?" He nodded, "Yes, I understand." Over the following weeks, I threw myself into my work, avoiding late-night meetings and keeping everything above board. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to reach out to him, to ask if he was okay, but I resisted. As time passed, the tension between us eased. Ken poured his energy into his startup, and I focused on being the wife Wilson deserved and the leader my company needed. Advice for women, to my fellow women, especially those in positions of power or influence, I want to say this: life will test you. It will present you with temptations that seem harmless at first, but can unravel everything you've worked so hard to build. When those moments come, remember who you are and what you stand for. Remember the people who believe in you, who depend on you, and the legacy you want to leave behind. Sometimes, walking away is the strongest thing you can do because strength isn't just about holding on, it's also about knowing when to let go. Stay true to yourself and never let fleeting emotions destroy what took years to create.